Lyra has just tipped my hand to the fact that I'm about the nerdiest human being in history. I once gave a 45-minute talk about elevators. I found it interesting, at least. Exactly. I gave a 45-minute talk about elevators. I'm not going to do that this evening. I am instead incredibly happy to be here. I'm really grateful for the warm welcome from both Allens and the Allens Hub. And it is delightful to be back in person. I know for some of us it's the first time that we've been back in person in a little while. I know for some of us we are visiting Australia, and we welcome our international visitors here as well. And I'm really excited that you picked this as your place to be a tourist here in Sydney tonight. I think that's excellent. What I want to do for the next 45 minutes is talk to you about a technological system that for some of us feels very distant and remote, and for others feels like a thing you might once have read about. I realise that I need to begin this, however, with the following confession. This work is relatively new to me. I've been thinking about this in this way for about the last year. I've been thinking about telegraphy and telegraph systems for at least the last 15 years. But this particular moment in time, I am profoundly and utterly obsessed. And I fear Gavin's already had his ear bent for the last 15 minutes, and he can nod sagely and go, she is obsessed. And I feel that it's in this moment in time, it's a bit like a new relationship. I want to tell you all about how exciting it is for me. And at some point you are going to go, okay, we're just done. I'm hoping that will be at the 45-minute mark, and then we can answer some questions. So when Lyra asked me to come and to talk in the context of technology, law, and innovation, I was thinking about what am I working on that might be interesting, and what are the lessons I might be able to extract from where I spend a bunch of my time. And for me that really was, how do we think about historic technical systems and the lessons we can learn from them, both that inform our present and also our future. And in this particular period of time, I have been thinking about large historic systems, particularly those that shape and change our ideas about time and space, ones that refactor the way we think about how we inhabit the world. That means over the last 15 or 20 years, I've spent my time thinking about everything from electricity to the internet. But really, if you want to think about what is the first technology that changes our way of thinking about the world because it connects the whole world, it is in some ways the telegraph system. So that's where we want to take this talk. The title of this talk comes from a line from a newspaper in 1885. So you're going to have to indulge me. Twice in this talk I'm going to read things out loud, which is not something I usually do. So the title of this talk comes from a newspaper article that's recounting the journey of the South Australian Premier Playford, who's travelling north on the newly completed Great Northern Railway. Some of us will remember that as the GAN Railway. This is an account of him slightly south of the town of Unadilla in April of 1888. And he writes in a diary that is then published in the newspaper, he says, "At Strangway Springs, we pulled up at the station," that's the railway station, "and were taken by buggy some 2 miles over a sandy plain to a range of low hills with again that peculiar feature of the country, the mound springs. Here we found the telegraph station and discovered that the people quartered there in that lonely spot knew more about what was going on in the outside world than we did ourselves. They could tell us the latest quotations of the share market for the day and the state of the German Empress' health, for they could read the instruments by sound, if nothing else, as the messages passed through." So here we have a system that connects the loneliest spot in Australia, Strangway Springs, to the movements of news and information through a technological system that you could read just by hearing it. So we talk about things in the 21st century. In some ways it has all of those characteristics, right? What are the cultural practices? What are the technical practices? What are the human practices? And what are the consequences of all of those? Were I to say to you now, pull out your phone, open Google Maps, type Strangway Springs into that, and you could if you'd like, pull out your phone, open Google Maps, type in Strangway Springs, you will find a little red dot on a very white screen. I said to a colleague of mine recently, he's like, where were you? I'm like, Strangway Springs. He's like, typing into Google, I can hear him. He's like, did I break it? I'm like, no. Like, you're just gonna have to pull the lens out just a little ways until you find a feature in the landscape that Google Maps recognizes. Of course, a whole lot of other people would recognize the features in that map almost instantly. And that's a good place to pause and say that I too want to acknowledge where we are today and on whose country I get to tell this particular set of stories. So for our colleagues visiting us here from the great state of Missouri, acknowledgements of country, or land acknowledgements, as you now call them in the United States, are one of the ways that we acknowledge the traditional owners of the place we find ourselves. We pay our respects explicitly and exquisitely to the people whose country we are on. We acknowledge the places those people have been and the worlds they have brought into, called into existence and keep together for this day. Here, that's the lands of the Gadigal people. Where I spend my time, that's the lands of the Ngunnawal Ngambri people. I imagine because we're being recorded here over weeks and months that unfold, this will be heard on the lands of many other traditional people around Australia and possibly around the world. And I want to pay my respects to elders past and present here in this place and in all the other places this unfolds. And whenever I get to talk about technology and technical systems, I get to do it in the knowledge and the privilege and the extraordinary responsibility of doing that in a place where people have been building technical systems for 60,000 years and keeping them for at least that long. The image here comes from a set of fish weirs that we would find north of here in the town of Bawarrina, on the Barwon River on the Queensland-New South Wales border. This is a set of fish weirs architected by a man named Byami about 15,000 years ago. They are read into our state heritage register under his name as the engineer of them. His sons built them to a design he created. That design is built to catch fish as they come down the river, hold them in clear running water at different depths depending on the size of the fish. It is designed to be able to do that with the river at different depths, and it is designed to be able to do that depending on the changing conditions of that river. It is a system, of course, that doesn't just rely on an incredible awareness of hydrology and lithics, so the study of water and stone, or ichthyology, fish. It also relies on an ability to think about social rules, so regulation. You can't have a system like this unless you have rules about who controls it, who uses it, under what circumstances, who gets to decide what fish are kept, how the fish are distributed, under what circumstances, whose fish, and how those things are enacted. This is a system that has been kept and maintained through 2 deglaciations, multiple changes in land and country and the ways in which that land and country was occupied. And when the River Barwon is not in flood, you will find the Aboriginal communities from this area standing on these weirs still fishing. So this is a system of extraordinary depth. And when I talk about technology, I think to myself, will I ever be able to imagine that I built something that would last 20,000 years? And I know the answer to that is always no. But I also know if I want to stand a chance at that, it's because it will be all 3 of the pieces of the puzzle. It will be the technological, the ecological, and the human. And it will be the bringing together of those 3 pieces that will make systems that matter. And of course, that means as we think about acknowledging on whose country we stand, land that was always sacred and never ceded, we also get to do it in the context of a place where people have been making technical systems with an awareness of the ecological and the human and the regulatory and the cultural for as long as there was. So, all the things Lyra didn't say because I asked her not to, I was like, please don't introduce me in all the ways we usually do, because I hate having my CV read out. I think it must be the Australian in me that feels deeply uncomfortable with the recitation of all the things I've done, but I also don't think it's helpful. So here are the things you do need to know. I'm a cultural anthropologist by training. I have a PhD from Stanford. My background was in Native American ethnohistory, feminist and queer theory. You might ask how that background ended up in a large technology company in Silicon Valley. The answer is I met a man in a bar because it was Palo Alto in the middle of the dot-com boom, and that's what girls did. I kept my job at Intel because it was the most extraordinary opportunity to think about the intersections of technological practice and cultural development, and because it was an opportunity to be in the middle of what I thought in the 1990s and the 2000s were the most interesting conversations you could have. About 6 years ago now, I heard the call from the Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University who told me it was time to come home. He didn't know that I had sat at a dining room table with Nugget Coombs a million years before in my childhood and listened to Nugget tell the stories of forming the Australian National University and of going around Australia and around the world with a briefcase of money and letters from then Prime Minister Chifley telling Australians it was time to come home, to start the National University. So when Brian said that to me, he had no idea that he was pulling on an old heartstring for me. I said no to him because I couldn't work out what I would do as a professor. I still don't know the answer to that. I ultimately said yes because it was an opportunity to build something. So flash forward 5 years, I find myself as the inaugural director of a brand new school at the Australian National University, the School of Cybernetics. My team and I are particularly interested in studying how it is that we can build, design, regulate, decommission, resist if necessary, technical systems. And how do we think about building those technical systems and building, indeed, more than just technical systems that bring together the human, the ecological, and the technical? How do we find ways of theorizing and making sense of that? One of the things that we discovered in that journey over the last 5 years is that a body of work that was done in the 1940s and 1950s in the United States under the banner of cybernetics was in fact a way of theorizing that very set of confluences, the very set of systems that were dynamic, that had emerging properties, that were complex and complicated, and that brought together the human, the ecological, and the technical. Over the last 2 years as a school, we've done a whole bunch of work in that space. We have worked with the National Library to think about how to add artificial intelligence into a library system. We've partnered with the National Gallery of Australia to work out what a cybernetic tour of the gallery would look like. We're working with the Queensland Ballet to think about drones and dance. And somewhere along the line, we also realised we wanted to look at systems that have been in the past and what you might learn from them. And for me, one of the things about systems is that they're very hard to see. It's quite hard to see a system. So it's usually moving, or pieces of it are moving, or people are moving through it. It has a dynamic quality to it. And knowing where the edges of it are actually really complicated. It turns out one of the easiest ways to see a system is in the rearview mirror, when it's not finished exactly, but when it's stabilized and the edges of it are fixed. That means we spend a lot of time thinking about systems as a unit of analysis. And for me, one of the things I've been particularly struck by in the discourse over the last 15 years, I guess, thereabouts, is as we move from thinking about what's the right way of interrogating the world around us. Is it about the individual? What is a human being doing? Is it about the nation state? What do a collection of human beings do? Is it about the company? Is it about the government? Is it about the citizen? I suspect it's all of those things. But I also think there is virtue and value in thinking about the system as a unit of analysis. Now, systems can be all kinds of things. They can be governments and laws and policies. They can simply be a transportation system or an electrical grid or a telegraph system. But working out how to make sense of a system, see its pieces and learn lessons from it is what we spend our time teaching our students, and it's why the Overland Telegraph line became a thing I started thinking about. So, as Gavin reasonably said, 150 years ago, the Overland Telegraph line was completed here in Australia. Actually, 150 years and 3 weeks. It went live for the first time, August 22nd, 1872. In all good technology stories, it went live for 3 days, then burnt out. And it took a little while to go live again. Turns out it was a complicated piece of technology and wasn't entirely stable. So what I want to do is tell you a little bit about the Overland Telegraph line and then unfold what I think are 5+1 lessons that emerge from it that we could pull forward into the 21st century that are helpful for thinking about technical systems today. There are lots of ways to tell the story of the Overland Telegraph line. There are some remarkable historical accounts of it that those of us who are old enough in the room will have read versions of them when we were young, that were in the kind of epic narratives of people traversing parts of the country with wagon carts and camels and engineers. There are stories about the early architects of it, the men who worked on it. There are stories about some of the things that flowed on it. There are surprisingly few holistic accounts of it. And when we started looking at this in my school, now in December of last year, the collection of research assistants that we brought on this journey with us, who were all horrifyingly born this century, knew nothing of it. So while some of us are old enough to remember when the telegraph was taught in school, here it wasn't taught to my students. So they had no idea what we were talking about when we started talking about the telegraph line. I mean, they didn't actually know what it was, let alone what the technology was, let alone what the hell is a telegraph. Delightfully, I mean, they're an extraordinary collection of people and they are now genuine experts in this space, but we did have to go through the moment of going, yeah, the reason that thing looks like that in the National Library Troves system is it's a digitization of microfiche. Yes, microfiche, the stuff you've seen in movies, yes, I've used it. Are you sure? Yes. Wow, how did you ever find anything? I'm like, that is such a good question. Did it have an index? Like, not a keyword one. But how did you ever find anything? I'm like, still a good question. So there are lots of ways of telling the story. You can tell it just by data. You can tell it by the number of poles, the number of kilometres, the number of people, the number of camels. 36,000 poles, 1,000 people, 150 camels, which turned out to be 80% of the camels in Australia at the point of origin. So you can tell that story. You can tell it as a story about Todd and all of his contemporaries. You can tell it as multiple versions of those stories. But what I wanted to do instead was something a little bit indulgent and read you the beginning of the piece I'm writing about this, because this is a moment for me when the words really matter. And when I want to think about how do we tell these stories in a sympathetic to the place we find ourselves kind of way. So, one day, a very long time ago, Karakuri, the ancestral green snake, met Yakoguku, the ancestral red-belly black snake, and they made camp for the night. Perhaps they yarned and told stories. Perhaps they sat together in a comfortable silence and watched the stars in an expansive night sky. Or perhaps they just rested, weary from a long journey soon to be completed and lives almost over. The place they stopped is called Pankai Roruna in Arabana, in my language, white ribs. That place where the ancestors camped is all fine sand and tiny pink and yellow flowers and white crystalline remains of an ancient spring that looks a little bit like ribs open up on the ground. It sits on trade routes for ochre and pitchery, native tobacco, or Aboriginal tobacco, and grinding stones. Here, stories move, information moves, people move, things move. Knowledge about that place and its springs and its seasons accumulated and was shared generation to generation, family to family. Far more recently, in October 1858, a man named Peter Egerton Warburton found his way to Pankai Roruna. His crude map of the region lacks detail, and his account of his travels point to a man unaware of the richness of the land he is traversing. He writes in his journal of the day, "I travelled only 17 miles this day in various short tacks, but the general course was northwest, through a remarkable jumble of little hills. There I found a third batch of springs, exceeding the first two in number and the extent of the country it covered, but on the whole not so active, and differing from the former batches in rising partly out of a small patch of low scrub. Most of these springs had formed limestone basins. Some of the water was very good, but much appeared strongly impregnated with calcareous material. I have no doubt these springs would improve greatly with use. I drank the water in pretty large quantities and found no ill effects." Thank you for that. These are called Strangway Springs, after H.P.T. Strangways Esquire, Member of Parliament, and the land around them is fit for pastoral purposes. Strangways was a member of the South Australian Parliament, and one wonders how he felt about this particular honour. Still, the politics of naming as a form of patronage and affiliation persist, but it's this characterisation of the area as fit for pastoral purposes that's the important piece. Wharton's presence here in Pankai Roruna was complicated. He'd actually been sent to locate another man, Benjamin Herschel Babbage, who'd been tasked with surveying the northern reaches of the colony of South Australia in the hopes of identifying new areas for pastoral activities. The oldest son of computer pioneer Charles Babbage, Herschel Babbage, as he was known throughout the colonies, was a respected civil engineer with an eye for detail. However, his deeply methodological approach had drawn the ire of the colonial officers who'd sent Warburton to retrieve him, because clearly they're like, "You're taking too long, mate," and complete the task of mapping in a more timely, albeit far less rigorous manner. So 12 years later, Herschel comes back to Pankai Roruna. Where the colonial government had complained about his ponderous approach, now they called on his assistance in what was arguably then the most important engineering project in Australia. Under the direction of Charles Todd, a man who Gavin and I have just been discussing, who is the indefatigable Postmaster General of the colony of South Australia, a telegraph line is to traverse the Australian mainland, south to north, connecting the far north coast with an undersea cable and connecting from there to Great Britain. So to a place called Porthcurno in the far south of Cornwall. So the shortest distance that you could get on the English mainland to the next cable beach. The Port Darwin line, that we now know it as the Overland Telegraph line, would be a 2-year-long engineering marathon. It builds on best practices, you'll be happy to know, from the transcontinental telegraph line in the United States, as well as one in India. So the Port Darwin line is built in three sections simultaneously. So best practice then was, rather than build the entire thing in one go, you build 3 pieces sequentially, or successively. So from Port Augusta to Alberta Creek. Alberta Creek would be near Unadilla, for those of you who know your South Australian geography. And then from Alberta Creek to Alice Springs, and then Alice Springs to Darwin. Herschel was charged with surveying just the southern section of the line, so just Port Augusta to Unadilla, and identifying 3 sites where a repeater station could be located. Parenthetically here, repeater stations are a really important part of this story, because in order to run the Overland Telegraph line, you need to have something to boost the signal every 350 kilometres. You need to build a building, fill it full of electricity, and keep the line running. So part of Babbage's task is to go find all the places you could do that. Now, think about the affordances you might need to put something where you could boost the signal. You need water. You need a place you can put a building. You need a sense that you are on the line that is being surveyed. And that's Babbage's job, to find those places in the southern section of the line. And so in October 1870, so 12 years after he's been there the first time, Babbage finds his way back to the place Warburton called Strangway Springs. When he arrives there, he encountered a working sheep station with stone pens, elaborate wool scours, and several rudimentary dwellings. And his impression is much more romantic than Warburton's. His can be found in a sketchbook. It's small and narrow, it's bound in brown leather, and it's held in the State Library in South Australia. And across 2 pages, he draws the springs and the little hillocks falling down. And even in the shades of grey and spare lines, it feels like it's alive. You can see the wind in the sedge and the samphire. I think I can hear the zebra finches chattering there, because I've been to that place and they're very noisy. And Warburton might have seen a jumble, but Babbage saw something else. Thousands of miles away from home and closer to the end of his life, he found a point on a map and connected it to a story, a place where messages would pass through. And in December of 1870, 2 months later, Charles Todd comes to this place and confirms Babbage's choice. And Pankai Warhuna becomes Strangway Springs and becomes a node on the telegraph line. Within 2 years of that moment, a line would stretch all the way from Adelaide to Darwin. And from Darwin, connecting undersea and overland all the way to London. So to Indonesia, India, across to the United Arab Emirates, up through Egypt, through the Mediterranean to Lisbon, Lisbon to London, via Perth Corno, which is the only thing that there is in that place in Cornwall, is a cable station. Still there now. It is, in fact, a large cable station to this day, because it's a really good place to bring up undersea cables. 6,000 poles would be cut from Australian trees. They needed 36,000 poles, so you notice a slight delta discrepancy there. It turns out one of the things they hadn't anticipated was there weren't a lot of trees between Port Augusta and Darwin. There's certain passes where there aren't any trees at all, and so there was a bit of a problem about finding trees. So 6,000 trees are cut and carted. The remaining 30,000 poles that are necessary are imported from Britain. Yeah, galvanised iron poles brought from England and then carted on the backs of camels and bullock drays along 3,200 kilometres to be deposited once every 80 metres. Hence 36,000 of them every 80 metres with wire strung between them. For those of you who care about the details, that would be a number 6 galvanised fencing wire that initially is strung at about this height, which is coincidentally the height of a man sitting on the back of a camel, because that's how it was spooled out, was a man on a camel winding it onto each pole and continuing to the next 80 metres. Ultimately, that would be Beltana. So we're going Port Augusta, Beltana, Strangway Springs, The Peak, Charlotte Waters, Alice Springs, Barrow Creek, Tennant Creek, Powell Creek, Charlotte Waters, the Catherine, and Yam Creek. You might notice something about all those places. Yes. And they form a chain of repeater station buildings linked by the galvanised fencing wire and strung along wooden and metal poles charged with copper sulphate wet cell batteries and held together, Gavin, you'll be happy to know, by rich bureaucratic process. And in August 1872, the circuit is complete. And in that moment, information becomes data, and communication no longer requires analog transportation. And time and distance mean two completely different things. It's the beginning of the digital world, the world that we now talk about, and it is the continuation of a world for the Arabana, which was 20,000 years at that point in the making. That's a story. One day I'll finish it. But let me tell you what the rest of that story means for you right here, right now. So if that's a story about poles and about wires and about surveying and about needing to find places to put a small hut into which you could put 6 staff, because you needed 2 to run the telegraph line because it runs 24 hours a day. You need 4 to maintain the quality of the line, because when you are running a single piece of galvanized fencing wire 250 kilometres between repeater stations, it requires constant maintenance. The affordances of the Australian system, completely different than the American one, is that the Australian one runs live the entire time. So it's always charged. And so when you wanted to send a telegraph, you broke the charge rather than turned it on. The American one, you turned on the power to send a message, because of course their line is more densely populated and closer to people. So you didn't have to worry so much about whether you could find the break in the signal. For the Australians, we ran the line live the entire time, which means every repeater station is powering the line, which creates a very different sense of who needs to be in those repeater stations and the work they're doing. So how is all of this relevant to 20th century and 21st century law? 6 things would be my guess. First one, it turns out, has to do with that very technological infrastructure, which turns out to be invisible. You can see the poles, and getting them turns out to be a complicated problem. Poles that are optimized for being carried on camels requires a patent for telescoping telegraph poles, which can collapse and be carried on camels. So the telegraph system generated an enormous run of patent-based activities for poles, for insulators, for all the technology that was necessary for carrying it. The invisible piece of technology was the electricity. Because let's just go back there for a second. 1872. No electricity running from power plants in 1872, and certainly not in Unadata. Instead, the Overland Telegraph line is powered by wet cell copper sulfate batteries. They're about this big, that size. Glass jar, glass funnel, copper sulfate crystals, pure water, plate, charge generated. 1 glass jar gives you 1 AA battery. You might need more than 1, it turns out. So the repeater stations actually needed 300 to go. That's a lot of tending of batteries. That's a lot of copper sulfate. That's a lot of glass jars. That's a lot of things you just can't pop down to Bunnings for in 1872. So it turns out to run this telegraph system, what you actually needed was a complex network of parts, supplies, knowledge, distribution channels, which meant you needed a functioning supply chain, which in this period of time is cameleers and camels. It's a network that gives us the Elders franchise. It's a network that connects to railway, and what you have running through here is all the things that are part of a technology system that aren't the obvious thing. It's not the wires and the poles, it's the batteries. And it's not just the batteries, it's everything that's required to make the batteries run. It's not just the batteries, it's the protocol you have to write to maintain the battery, because it turns out maintaining a wet copper sulfate battery is a skill. It turns out maintaining them requires a whole ritual and a book and a manual. So when we think about building systems in the 21st century and we say, oh, it's a technical system, lurking underneath of it are a whole series of other technical systems that are necessary to make that technical system true, whether it is electricity, telecommunications, and then all the things that supply that system in turn, and how it is that you uncover and excavate all of the interdependencies, and how you think about which pieces of those then become critical, i.e., in regulating this, we might need to regulate that thing too. In determining that this is important, it turns out this other thing is important too. You couldn't run the Overland Telegraph line without camels. It's not something we tend to think to ourselves, oh, 21st century technology, what's the camel equivalent? But we probably should be asking ourselves that very question, because there will be one. The camels in turn then necessitate people who work with camels, who in turn created communities that Australia was not yet ready to deal with and required other pieces of the puzzle. If you were running a camel train in Unadada and Mari in the 1870s and 1880s, chances are you're actually Muslim. Chances are you've got your iman in that community and you are working out how to eat halal in places that didn't know necessarily what that was. So cascading effects of technology. Wet cell copper sulfate batteries. The patent on this is originally from 1850. The last time they were used in Australia in an Australian government system appears to be 1952, when they were still powering remote signal boxes on the South Australian Railway, because you'd leave them for 3 weeks at a stretch and they just discharged power at the lightest possible way. So the other thing to think about here is technologies aren't quite as generational as we sometimes imagine, and you may end up with a system sitting on top of much older technological apparatus. That also means every infrastructure is an embedded infrastructure. One of the remarkable things about getting to do fieldwork in the 21st century, other than digital indexes on microfiche, is drones. So my colleagues and I put a drone up. This is about 25 kilometres south of Mari in South Australia, so on the Overland Telegraph line. You should be able to read this picture, oh God, left to right. This here is the remains of the Great Northern Railway that Playford took north. Sitting immediately to the left of it is actually the Overland Telegraph line. Sitting immediately to the left of the Overland Telegraph line is a camel pad, or a camel walking train, because camels were actually in this area before the Overland Telegraph line. That camel pad sits on top of an Aboriginal trade route, because people were moving through this area, circulating grinding stones in particular, but also ochre. So people were walking through this area and had walked through this area for generations. So when the camels come along, they are following the same tracks that humans have walked, because those tracks take them from waterhole to waterhole and shaded tree to shaded tree. And when the telegraph line comes along, they follow the camel pad because they're following water. When the railway comes along, they follow the telegraph line because that's where people are already living and because that's where a whole lot of stuff already is. By the time you get to the 20th century, that means the land you fence off is following where the railway has been, because the government has owned that land, and so now you fence it. Once you've got a nice straight line like this, it turns out what you really want to do is dig a trench right here. And in that trench you might bury your NBN cable network. And then, of course, you have a road. Now, that all makes really good sense at one level. You've got this nice piece of land, just going to things in straight lines. If you're rectilinear, it's excellent. You just keep going. Here's the problem. A camel pad follows a human walking train because you need water. That makes sense. A telegraph line, loosely the same thing. Think of all those names with water. Yam Creek, Daly River, that kind of thing. A railway in the 1880s still needed water because we're still talking about steam. The NBN, not so much. The road, absolutely not. And this place here washes out whenever it rains because it's a floodplain, because that's a good place to walk if you're looking for water, and an excellent place to camp if you want to camp near water. It's not a good place to put fibre optic cable or a road, because what's going on here is the logic of infrastructures follow earlier ones. And those earlier ones are solving different problems, but they shape the way we deploy things moving forward. So now ask yourself, pick a new technical system we're talking about deploying. Well, we're going to deploy the metaverse. Okay. Where does the metaverse sit on this spectrum? Is this the camel pad? Is this the NBN fibre that's being deployed in a place where a whole lot of things have already happened, the logic of which does not adhere to the thing you are building? Are you building a new way of communicating, but the infrastructure you are building it on is from communicating a different set of things? How do you unpack all the infrastructures and all the assumptions that sat underneath of them and all the choices that were made, many of which made perfectly good sense at the time? It is very sensible to walk your camels near where there is water. That is a fine and logical decision to make. It is very different to dig a trench in that same place, but you're doing it because a whole series of other decisions in the interim have happened. So how do we unearth these? How do we think about them? How on earth would we imagine them in a regulatory frame? And what will be the laws that start to manage infrastructure? And, Gavin and I were talking earlier about submarine cables, which frankly follow a similar kind of logic. So the cables that sit underneath the oceans that carry the internet have some of the same challenges to this here. But thinking about our infrastructure and the ways in which they are constantly embedded and the logics that sit within them, hugely important. Third one, maybe, has to do with who is telling the story and what is the story that is being told, and how do we make sure as we are imagining these technologies that we are listening to all the voices or the right voices or giving them the right history. This is in fact the illustration from Babbage's notebook. So this is Strangway Springs, 1870, as he imagined it. This is, of course, one version of this country that gets told. It's one version of the story. Knowing who are all the people who have a point of view about the system and all the ways those points of view get articulated, read, remembered, celebrated, and by whom is deeply complicated. And knowing the biographies of the people that were doing that work turns out, at least for me, to be really important. Knowing who Babbage is and why he is there and what else he'd been doing before he got there help you understand why he picked this place. It wasn't just about water, it was about his desire as a civil engineer for a particular kind of order. It also has to do with a whole lot of his history and the places he'd been before, about what he thinks he saw here. And he isn't the only one who described or imagined this system. There are lots of other people who told stories about the Overland Telegraph line, who both mythologize and make mysterious what's going on there. And the voices that do and don't get remembered here is hugely important. We can have Babbage making this beautiful illustration, and then we can have a series of accounts about the massacres at Barrow Creek, which don't do a good job of articulating what the dispute is actually about. Because those are contemporary NEC newspaper accounts written by a very particular set of people imagining what's happening there. And so how the narratives get constituted about systems, who gets to tell those stories, where those stories appear, also shape how these technologies are made sense of. The fact that it was Babbage making this decision meant that Babbage's name was known in London. Him saying this was a good place carried weight in more than just the conversation he was in. He helped these systems make sense and have gravitas in England because of his familial connections. And, oh, by the way, he's doing all of this to rehabilitate his reputation as a man who got lost. So knowing why people are there and what they are doing and what the other deals are that are being done about how choices get made around technology systems is not simply what was best. It's what are the other forces at work that are shaping those choices, and how would you disinter them or, frankly, document them as they start to determine what's going on there. And then, of course, you have to think about, in imagining these systems, and I think that's very clear to me from the Overland Telegraph line, but as we think forward, where's the node and where's the network? Like, as we imagine the system, what are the points in that system? How do they stabilize and how might you know them? This is the very same place that you just saw Babbage's picture of. This is the very same repeater station, but a year ago, not 150 years ago. It is a place that is now not somewhere. Messages don't pass through here. It is delightfully not on any telecommunications grid. If you go there, your phone does not work. You cannot find the health of the German emperor. There is no health of the German emperor to be had here. There is no stock market. You have to go 100 kilometers in either direction to find that, and then you will. Now, of course, a whole lot of other things are going on here. It doesn't need to be a node in the Overland Telegraph line to be a place of meaning and relevance. And so how we think about systems where places are multivocal, right, where they do multiple different pieces of work, where the network here is a network of meaning made by the Arabana, whose country this has always been, where this is a place where all kinds of messages pass through all the time, and where this is a place that when it was on the Overland Telegraph line was part of the cultural geography, are all really important. But when you go there, you realise that the cultural imagination of this telegraph line is exquisitely British. The telegraph station is facing south, looking towards Adelaide, so that it could see a rider coming with news from home.
Now, of course, once it connects to the telegraph line, south is no longer the important geography, right? It's actually north and south simultaneously, but they never reorient the building. And there's something kind of remarkable about knowing it's a homestead before it is a telegraph station, and then its imagined geography is very particular. So as we imagine 21st century systems, knowing what is the node, whether the node is a node in many networks, what those networks are, how we document them, and what the dynamics are all critical questions. Because lots of places will be, I guess, multinodal, or at least there'll be nodes in other nodes. So like this was never just one thing, right? It was a railway station and a telegraph station and a sheep station. It's the generator of patents on wool scouring and water technology, and it's a place where you could find out the health of the German emperor all at once. So multiple places will be like that. So as we think about systems and imagining their regulation and constitution, it's never going to be one, right? It will always be many. And then almost last, penultimately, here is the unexpected consequence of a system. This system was designed to make messages pass through. It was designed for telegraphy, right? When this system goes live on the 22nd of August, it goes from taking 45 days on the fastest clipper ship there was in the world with a really good wind behind you to get from London to Adelaide. 45 days. That means it's 90 days for a round trip if you were standing in the harbour in Adelaide going, thank you, give me the message, I'll send you a message, go instantly back. That's 3 months if you're doing it well. Chances are it was always more than that. 45 days. When this goes live, it's 4 hours. 4 hours and 36 pairs of hands. Now, 36 pairs of hands means a little bit of noise in the message because you're relying on people accurately reinscribing the message and sending it back telegraph station to telegraph station. But I am willing to assert there is almost no other moment in the last 150 years where we saw a change in time like that. 45 days to 4 hours is extraordinary in what it does in terms of shortening distance, in changing the way we think about how things move, and in reimagining certain kinds of cultural geographies. Now, it also did something else, because not everything is suited to ... Not everything is suited to a conversion to Morse code. Not everything is suited to a conversion to paying by the word. Not everything is suited to going through 36 pairs of hands. So what happens in this moment is that we go from having, communication, I think, to information, and we may go from information to data, because a whole new class of stuff is created that moves freely down these lines and that moves better down these lines. Although I give Charles Todd props for this. Once a month, he used to dedicate the line to people being able to send scientific papers backwards and forwards by telegraph. I'm willing to bet that wasn't a good experience. Instead, what you had was things that were short and pithy, telegraphic, that could be sent well down the line. New business models emerged. This is how Reuters and the AAP came into existence. This is why the Daily Telegraph is called the Daily Telegraph, because it was about short, pithy things you could send down the wire. And certain kinds of information moved better that way, and certain kinds of information didn't. And if you could pay for the word, that was good too. We certainly developed familial codes and shorthands, but a whole different way of moving information came into existence through this system. And a whole lot of people who were better at creating information for this system also came into existence. So not only does it create a form of information, it creates a new set of expertise and a new set of authors and a new set of decoders. And that's a kind of well-known story, if you're nerdy, about telegraphs. Creates information, ruptures the relationship between communication and transportation. That's all good. And that's the global story, right? It also, of course, in India shortens the distance between the colonial office and the home office, which makes the Indian administration more closely bound to England, and means you can expect action much more quickly if you were sitting in the British Home Office. I'm interested by how long it took for anyone to decide to connect Australia, which is much later than the Indian telegraphy connection. Not a lot going on here anyone cared about, I think, is one way to think about that. However, one of the things that is less told about the Australian story is that Charles Todd, in addition to being a technocrat of the first order and a man who could administer the hell out of anything, He decided if you were going to put telegraph stations every 250 kilometres to reboost the signal, that was an opportunity to collect weather data. And in every telegraph station in his jurisdiction, he equipped every telegraph master with 3 weather collecting devices. One for collecting air pressure and weather strength, one for collecting water, and one for kind of collecting basically barometric pressure. And initially, once a day, and by the 1890s, 4 times a day, he asked his telegraph masters to send the weather from wherever they were in South Australia to Adelaide. In exchange for which, once a day, he sent out the time. It's an interesting quid pro quo. Once a day, they cleared the line, and like the time ball here, at 1 p.m., everyone around South Australia knew it was 1 p.m. because every telegraph station said it's 1 p.m. In exchange for which, you sent the weather back in the other direction. Now imagine, in the 1870s, meteorological forecasting globally was not particularly sophisticated. Todd and his colleagues are the first people to work out that if it's raining in Eucla, it'll rain in Whyalla. If it's rain in Whyalla, it'll rain in Adelaide. If it's rain in Adelaide, it's going to rain in Renmark. And they worked out how the weather moved. They were the first people to see weather patterns. They're the first people to create meteorological data. The Bureau of Meteorology still uses the maps that Todd and his colleagues created because they did it for 35 years. This is one of those maps. They collected all of the weather. And so telegraph might have been about messages passing through, but it also made data. It made a set of tools that every time you open your bomb app on your phone, which I'm willing to bet almost everyone does daily, you are building on data that was made through a telegraph system whose intent was never to collect weather data. But the presence of every one of those objects became a way of doing that. So as we talk about building technical systems, there is always an interesting question about what other things will sit on top of those systems and what other worlds and knowledge will they make possible. And it's less clear to me how you anticipate those things except to know that they always will be there. This case, it's intentional. Todd was very determined to use this network to prove that meteorology could be a science. And he was very determined to prove that you could find things. He found the Southern Oscillation. He found a whole series of weather patterns that we now know to be true. But it was him collecting data and discovering that you could see the weather that changed the way we thought about something utterly unexpected. So, ideas about infrastructure, ideas about technology, ideas about the humans in the loop, the places that it happens, the data that it creates. And of course, in this instance, the country that it traverses, in the place that I've been spending my time in, Strangway Springs, it's always been Arabana country. It is Arabana country still. It was Arabana before the Strangway Springs, it was Arabana after. It is a place where Indigenous people also worked out how to use those systems to their advantage. So when the railway line comes to Strangway Springs, the Arabana there contract with the local railway company to move their ochre from Lyndhurst to Strangway Springs. They're like, okay, if we pay you, will you bring the ochre here so we don't have to carry it on our heads? Well, actually, it turns out you can give people money and they will do exactly that. And so for a generation, the Arabana used the railway to increase their traditional realm and to ensure that their ceremonial life could continue despite a series of complexities on their country that we know did not necessarily get experienced so positively elsewhere. I'm not sure this one is positive, but it is at least an interesting example of what you can do when you use those systems differently. The reason I think it's important here, because when we teach our students to talk about systems, we teach them to start where they start, to start where you stand. And as we build technical systems here in Australia, we need to do them fully aware of on whose country we are doing them and with whose grace we get to do them, and about what pieces of Indigenous knowledge and learnings we should build into our systems and how we should do that in a manner that is both responsible and respectful. And so for me, when I think about the telegraph system and all the other systems we study, imagining that you have to start where you start, not an imagined place, but a real place. Not a fantastical imagining of a technology that has no history, no country, no people, but one that is in a particular place, in a particular moment of time, and doing a particular piece of work. So with that, I want to stop, I believe, and say, effectively, you should imagine that the Overland Telegraph line was always more than just a thing that messages passed through. It was always more than just a telegraph system. And in exploring it, it has a whole series of things that can tell us about how we might build technologies now in the 21st century. Because building systems that are whole of world, that require huge infrastructural expenditure, but also shape the lives and change the lives of people in ways intended and unintended. 36 pairs of hands is probably better than 45 days on a ship, knowing the weather is excellent. I imagine for some of us here, the notion of 45 days as a turnaround time sounds like a really lovely thing to impose on our inboxes. Really sorry. It's going to be 45 days before I can get back to you on that. And by the way, I'm sending you all the words, not just 5 words. There's something about those notions about time and space and their inevitable rupture that are kind of delightful to contemplate. But I do want to kind of suggest that, for me at least, I think there is something we can learn from these older systems because we can see them clearly. And if we're willing to look back at them, not in a form of nostalgia, not in a form of jingoistic celebration, and not in a form of naivete, but as a way of saying, these are systems that shaped our world today, because telegraphy did, right? Telegraphy made the world that Aaron and I move in. It made electrical engineering and computing possible. But also because these systems in their completeness tell us something about the worlds we might build now. So, I told you I could nerd out for a really long time. And I realize I may not be the best advertisement for the thing I'm next about to put on the screen, but we're hiring. So if someone in your world is just this nerdy about something else, you should send them our way. So one of the wonderful things about getting to build a new school in the 21st century is you get to invite other people along on the journey. And one of the nicest things for me about coming home and getting out of Silicon Valley is that I get to be away from the story that says it's always a lone inventor doing it by themselves. And I get to say, no, actually the world is made in conversations, in collaborations, in relationships, in teams, in the productive discomfort that comes from multiple different voices in the room. So I am sure in this room there are people who have people in their networks that might think that was a good invitation. So my request is you share. And with that, I am going to stop it.